What's up guys, Miles here with 95Mac. If you're a fan of good ideas, consider subscribing to the channel for future content like this. Today we're going to be putting the brand new iPad Air 5 up against the iPad Air 4 from 2020. The Air 4 has been my personal iPad for daily use for nearly 2 years now, so it's going to be quite interesting to see for me how much more I like this newer version. The design is where you're going to find the least amount of changes between these two devices. The thinness, lightness, and layout of the buttons are all identical between these two tablets. So if you were expecting any physical changes in terms of the design, you're probably better off keeping your Air 4. So far, the only physical difference between the two has been related to build quality. If you watched my first Air 5 video from a few days back, you saw that there's basically a build quality flaw with certain examples of the Air 5. When holding the device in a certain way or applying slight pressure in certain areas with your hand, you can feel the tablet like click or creak, and that's essentially the tablet's aluminum housing making contact with the device's internals. This isn't something that was ever an issue with the Air 4, so it's honestly strange to see this here. And while this isn't happening to every single Air 5, there are definitely a considerable amount of users experiencing this issue. Because of this, I'd probably recommend holding off on placing an order until Apple gives us some sort of confirmation that the issue's been addressed, because for $600, there's really no excuse for poor build quality like this. The big marketing push for the iPad Air 5 is the fact that it's now powered by the Apple M1 chip, the same processor found in the new Mac Mini, the new iMac, the new MacBook Air, the new MacBook Pro. Basically, this is a desktop class CPU inside of a tablet, which theoretically allow for you to do a whole lot more with this new iPad Air. On paper, nearly everything has been doubled. The M1 chip features an 8-core CPU compared to the Air 4's 6-core processor, and then you've got an 8-core GPU in M1 compared to the 4-core GPU in the Air 4. And then you're getting 8GB of memory in the Air 5 compared to the Air 4's 4GB of memory. But let's see exactly how much more powerful the M1 chip is than the A14 Bionic chip found in the iPad Air 4. Geekbench 5 is a popular benchmarking tool that will allow us to see numerically how much more powerful the M1 chip inside of the Air 5 is compared to the Air 4's A14 Bionic. The single core difference in performance is pretty marginal between these two tablets. We've got over 1500 on the Air 4 and a score of over 1700 on the Air 5. And that basically means that the performance for the more mundane tasks won't really differ between these two devices, but there's a pretty huge difference in multi-core performance. The Air 4 scored under 5,000 for multi-core, while the Air 5 scored well over 7,000. And so on paper, there's going to be a pretty substantial difference for the more intensive productivity in gaming scenarios. And we can get an even better idea of how graphically intensive programs will compare between the two by running the Metal Compute benchmark, which is stressing the GPU directly. And there's once again a pretty massive difference. The Air 4 scored over 12,000, while the Air 5 scored over 20,000. And given the fact that you've got double the GPU cores in the Air 5, this isn't necessarily a shocker. And Tune2 is another benchmarking application that tests the overall CPU, GPU, and memory of a device. And I like Tune2 in particular because you can see the benchmarks in real time and see how smoothly or not smoothly everything runs. And when looking at these devices run the benchmark side by side, there's definitely a minor difference between these two. There's definitely some minor lag and stutter on the Air 4 compared to the Air 5, but nothing major per se. The iPad Air 4 came in with a score of over 720,000, while the Air 5 came in with a score of well over 1,060,000, and that's obviously a pretty huge difference in performance. And so the extra CPU and GPU power is definitely getting put to work here, and that should definitely translate to real-world use case scenarios. I also wanted to run the storage test in Tune2 because the Air 5 comes with an upgraded USB-C port with 10 gigabits per second data transfer speeds, compared to the Air 4's 5 gigabyte per second transfer speed. So theoretically, the Air 5 should have much higher performance within this benchmark compared to the Air 4. And when looking at the total scores, there's definitely something wrong, because my Air 4 consistently outperformed the Air 5 for this disk speed test. I ran the test several times on both devices, and I couldn't get my Air 5 to get over 700 megabytes per second write speeds, while the Air 4 consistently got over 1300 megabytes per second write speeds. Both devices are running iPadOS 15.4. Both devices have the same base storage, 64 gigabytes, so I'm honestly not sure what's up with this. But I hit up a friend who has a 256 gigabyte Air 5, he ran the test and got a much better score than I got on my Air 5. So I guess there's just something wrong with my model. In addition to the poor build quality, we've got SSD issues as well. So don't take this benchmark as an example of how the Air 5 should perform in general, but this is definitely a strange one. 3D Mark is another great benchmarking tool for seeing how the Airs can handle heavy 3D graphics. You get a numerical score for the test, but you also get the average frame rate, which gives you a pretty good idea of how the GPU can handle tasks like gaming. And the Air 5 scored just about double the frame rate of my Air 4. And this makes perfect sense given the massive GPU upgrade you're getting with the M1 chip. The Air 4 is scoring above about 75% of all devices within the wildlife benchmark, while the Air 5 is scoring above 92% of all devices for this benchmark. So there's a pretty huge difference for graphically intensive tasks in particular. And so for gaming in particular, the Air 5 is probably the way to go here. I wanted to do an export test on Lumafusion to see how faster you can export projects for high quality footage like 4K 120 frames per second clips from my Canon R5. I had the exact same project loaded up on both devices and ran an export to see what the real world difference would be. My Air 4 completed this 3-minute video export in around 2 minutes and 16 seconds, while the Air 5 completed the export in 1 minute and 51 seconds. And given the massive CPU and GPU difference between these two, I was honestly a little disappointed with how close these results were. But needless to say, the Air 5 is definitely going to be the better performer for applications like Lumafusion. But if you're already using the Air 4 and using Lumafusion on it a lot, jumping to the Air 5 for that reason in particular probably isn't worth it. The speakers on the iPad Air 5 don't have any real hardware advantages over the Air 4, but I wanted to do a speaker test to see if there's like any difference in overall sound quality or in the tuning of the sound profile between these devices. When listening to both devices back to back, you really have to listen closely to notice the differences, and so far, the only difference I can make out is slightly more low-end clarity on the Air 5 here, but it's not at all a make or break difference between these two devices, and overall, they both sound freaking great given the chassis it's inside. The back camera on the Air 5 is more or less identical to the Air 4. You've got a single 12 megapixel wide-angle lens on the back that can record video up to 4K at 60 frames per second, and you'll be hard-pressed to find pretty much any differences in image quality for the rear camera. But the front-facing camera on the Air 5 has been upgraded to a 12 megapixel sensor with center stage. So in addition to an upgrade in megapixels, you've now got a massive field of view for that front camera, which has a lot of practical use case scenarios. But when looking at these side by side, I think it's quite apparent how much having that wide of an angle affects the overall image quality for the cropped image, because you can see that the Air 4 just looks so much better using the standard field of view. And so center stage, while very useful, does come at a cost of overall quality if you're asking me. Both the Air 4 and 5 are rated for up to 10 hours of use according to Apple, and realistically you could achieve that number with like very light usage throughout the day, but realistically my Air 4 usually gets around 6.5 to 7 hours of usage, and while that isn't bad at all, I always found the standby time to be pretty lackluster on my Air 4. I felt as though I couldn't really rely on picking the tablet up after a few days of leaving it on standby, but that honestly hasn't been a problem at all with my Air 5. I've experienced notably better standby time, and I found that the Air 5 usually lasts around 45 minutes to an hour longer than my Air 4 does for daily use. And I wouldn't doubt it at all if that improved battery optimization was all a result of the Apple M1 chip. Overall, there are benefits in power you're getting with the Air 5 over the Air 4. There's the improvements for the front-facing camera, slightly better tuning for the speakers, and the improved battery life, but is any of that worth upgrading to the Air 5 from the 4? Well, my answer is no. I think anyone who wanted the best performance they could get from an iPad would just buy the iPad Pro. The M1 chip inside of the Air is great, but without things like a higher refresh rate display, it truly does feel the same as my Air 4 for most things. If this tablet came with a 90Hz or 120Hz panel, or perhaps a quad speaker setup, or something else besides the M1 chip that gives this iPad Air 5 an overall edge compared to the Air 4. I think it'd be easier to recommend to Air 4 users to upgrade, but with the current build quality issues in particular and the low storage for the base model, this is a bit of a hard sell for me personally. But let's say you don't have an iPad right now and are considering the Air 5. I'd say go to an Apple store and play with an iPad Pro after messing with an Air 5, and I think that'll make the decision a lot more clear as to what iPad is right for you at this point. But if this video was any help in making that decision, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for future content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.